Appreciate you.
All right, so first of all, I'm jealous. You've got the real comfortable shoes on compared to these that are supposed to be and aren't. But by the way, I do have to note, after I picked on Senator Scott for having snazzier socks, my kid went out last night and bought me golfer socks so I could have something. So now, let's talk about ESG first. For those who don't know what it is, can you just really explain what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very simple concept. They try to confuse it and make it all about these technical scores and this nonsense. ESG is the phenomenon of the financial services industry, whether it's big asset managers, big banks, or big insurers, trying to use their market power, often coordinating with each other in the market, to push a far left progressive agenda. So asset managers use the shares that they hold as stewards, as fiduciaries. Big banks use it as criteria for their loan portfolio. You have to sign up to all this nonsense before you can get financing. And the insurers just say you can't get a policy unless you accept all of these different requirements.
Okay, so now I guess one of the big issues is why, as fiduciaries, just go through the trouble. I mean, obviously the road answer is to advance left-wing causes, but I mean, there's a real agenda behind what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a mixed motivation, so it's different for different people. A lot of the ESG trend you saw in the investment space was really driven by the fact that as we move from an era of active investment with really high fees to a period of passive investment, I would imagine most of the people in here have moved money into ETFs over probably the last decade or so with a much lower fee structure. Wall Street was just desperate for some sort of gimmick to excuse raising those expense ratios back up. And ESG for a lot of fund managers fit the bill, right? They could say, oh, we're doing all this extensive scoring around all these different new axes that you need to enhance your returns. So you need to pay us, 3 times, sometimes 4 times the fees that you would for the equivalent, S&P 500 index or something like that. So that's one bucket. But then I think if we're talking about BlackRock and Fink, I think we're talking about a very different motivation, which is, Charlie Munger, the famous investor, said he's a would-be emperor, right? He gets to walk around corporate America and basically everyone has to do his bidding, or they risk, having boards of directors replaced at their company, being fired themselves. So I think, C.S. Lewis said that nothing excites a man more than the idea of getting to move other men around like toy soldiers. And I think that that's what you see with Larry Fink. He's gotten drunk on this power, and some of the other asset managers like State Street and Vanguard as well.
Yeah, so, I mean, those are the big players. You've got BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. They, by having fiduciary duty over our retirement funds, our pensions, they get to use the votes because none of us, I mean, if I own individual stock, I get the shareholder report and whatnot, but for these, they do, and so they get to steer this really progressive agenda. And what I find remarkable, and I didn't process this until you just said it, is the fees go up, and ESG is an excuse to judge the fees, and yet the rates of return for a lot of companies that follow ESG aren't nearly as good as those that don't.
That's absolutely right. And if you look at a lot of these funds that have ESG on the label, it's usually like the equivalent benchmark index. So let's say like a ESG S&P 500 fund, they'll just take out like 4 or 5 companies so that the holdings aren't exactly the same. And then they'll just slap a higher fee ratio on it and send it to market. It's not that even much different. That's probably for the best, honestly, because the more you do ESG, the lower your returns become. So you actually want less ESG, not more. But then what BlackRock is doing, which I think is in some ways even more nefarious, at least if you're investing in a fund that has ESG on the label, at some level you're accepting these lower returns, you're accepting the consequences of that. But BlackRock and some of the other asset managers like State Street, for example, have joined these groups like Climate Action 100, where in order to join, you've promised to use 100% of your assets under management. Not just the stuff you have in the ESG funds, but the stuff you have in the normal like iShares S&P 500 index fund to advance things like net zero, which for those who don't know, net zero is this idea that we're going to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. It's based on the Paris Accords that we're in via executive order when there's a Democrat in the White House. We're out via executive order. Even a democratically held Senate couldn't pass the Paris Accords as a matter of treaty and therefore U.S. law. And yet BlackRock is running around saying, we're going to push net zero with every share in our portfolio because we just assume that eventually all these governments are going to get around. And that's how they argue that it's within their fiduciary duty, is they make an assumption about where politics is going based on really no data, just their own wishful thinking. And then they say, well, we're just preparing for the future as we know it's going to come about. So that's kind of how they try to wedge their political agenda into the their legal fiduciary duty. But it's really, I think that's why I wanted to describe ESG as the phenomenon and not just the technical term. Because a lot of people don't realize, they think, oh, I've looked at my portfolio. I don't have a single fund that says ESG on it. But if you have money with BlackRock, if you have money with State Street, you own ESG funds because they are using your shares to push a far left agenda.
So, you mentioned Larry Fink, his ideas of politics. One of the things I've discovered in politics over time is that a lot of the super wealthy people who play in politics really don't have any idea how it works or what's actually going to happen. And they presume because of their financial genius, they also have this political genius. And Larry Fink seems to me to be someone who is overplaying his hand on this. I mean, I know you guys, and I find it very funny, have done ad campaigns targeting him directly by name that he's finally had to respond to. And he does seem to be this aloof person who just, like a Michael Bloomberg who could spend $1 billion and get no return on investment running for president. You've got Larry Fink spending other people's money to advance this agenda.
Yeah, I think that's right. He's a well-known member and constant speaker at Davos and the World Economic Forum. He runs around doing events with the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton Initiative. And I think living in that bubble, everyone tells you all this. Klaus Schwab tells you all this stuff is inevitable. That there's no chance, there's no opposition, there's no dissidence. Democracy's basically irrelevant. All this stuff is inevitable, and so he may sincerely believe it. He may sincerely, I guess, believe that he thinks this is inevitable. That said, part of the fiduciary duty isn't just a duty that a duty of loyalty. It's a duty of care. You can't just make wild political assumptions and base your investment thesis on that. You have to have something to back that up. When you look at the fact that neither political party is talking about, even bringing up passing the Paris Accords or any of this other stuff as a matter of law, it's all wishful thinking. It's all I want there to be us be moving to net zero. Therefore, I'm going to force every company in America to move to net zero, and that's within the fiduciary duty because of the assumptions I made.
Now, you and I were talking backstage, and it took me a minute to remember, but I distinctly remember Common Core, when conservatives were finally realizing this isn't a good idea for our kids in education. Mike Pence was governor of Indiana at the time and started pressuring the state school board to get rid of it. Well, we're not using Common Core, we're using something called Community Core. And it's different from Common Core, but it was the exact same agenda. And I mean, I hear Larry Fink and BlackRock and State Street them say, well, we're moving away from ESG, and it just sounds like a relabeling campaign.
Yeah, 100%. A few months ago, he was at the Aspen Ideas Festival, and he got asked, what about this fight that's going on? And he actually admitted that he was ashamed that he'd been dragged into it, and that he said he was going to stop using the term ESG. Now, in the same breath, he said, but don't get me wrong, I'm still a conscientious capitalist, which is basically just a way of rebranding, what he's doing. That's kind of what we're seeing going on in this space right now. 18 months ago when we launched our ads on BlackRock and ESG, most people didn't know what it was. So that was the first part, is educating people. And then as people started to understand it, they really started to hate what it did. And BlackRock tried to launch this counter campaign called About BlackRock. They probably spent somewhere between $20 and $30 million on that campaign. It went nowhere. So now what they're moving to, like you said, is a rebranding campaign. We will probably stop hearing from the left about ESG. They're now ashamed of it. They understand how much people hate it. They're going to come up with some other term. Sustainability is probably a candidate. Stakeholder capitalism, you're probably going to hear about that. And I guess they probably workshopped some term that he soft launched by saying conscientious capitalism. The other thing they're going to do, and this is something we've seen BlackRock kind of attempt a couple times. We'll see if they're any more successful this time. But they're going to try to pay off the right with a pittance, with a tip. They kind of have cycled through a number of rental Republicans to try and kind of be the face. They'll speak out of both sides of their mouth. To the left, they'll say, oh no, we're still doing everything we said we were going to do, to the New York City comptroller and to CalPERS and everything. Oh, we're pushing hard. Then they'll go and hire, like they had somebody out of Jay Clayton's SEC for a while. She didn't work out. Now they've hired John Kelly, who's this guy, not the White House chief of staff, right. the corporate hack. He his whole career has been basically moving from left-wing corporation to left-wing corporation, being sort of the Republican ombudsman, going, they don't really hate you as much as they say they do. Don't worry. His last job was at Starbucks, that famously neutral, politically neutral corporation, where he was there, trying to calm Republicans at the same time that Starbucks is banning, the mention of Christmas from their stores and their cups and everything. So that's their next step. He just started there. So I'm sure they'll be running around DC trying to see who they can on the right, who they can pay off. But I don't think it's going to work. I think people are hip to the tricks that the corporate America often plays when they're attacking conservative principles. We've seen this with Anheuser-Busch and Target. People are frustrated and tired of it. I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
Okay, so let's actually spend a moment on the Anheuser-Busch situation, which to me, it still boggles my mind that there's been no further accountability in that organization other than the two marketing people out, that you have this organization that it relies on independent mom and pop family-owned distributorships to distribute a product. So many of them are now financially struggling and laying off because of two woke marketing heads at Anheuser-Busch who decided to blow up the brand, condescend to the consumers, hire the trans activists to promote Bud Light. And I honestly, I keep waiting for the CEO to lose his job, for InBev to come down on him, given the finances. Yet there doesn't seem to be a level of accountability.
No, I think this gets to the real tragedy of the ESG and BlackRock scheme, because we were all taught in Econ 101 that if you hire somebody to run a company, you want them to make money. If they stop making money, you fire them. And if they blow up the company, you fire them. Why does that CEO still have a job? And I think really the answer is ESG and these large asset managers, because they've hoovered up all of these state, local, and federal pension funds. BlackRock manages a large portion of the federal thrift savings plan, university endowments, these huge pools of capital. And again, it's not their money, it's our money collectively, it's the state's money, pension funds, that kind of thing. And because they end up controlling, collectively, sometimes 25, 30%, if you're talking about the big three asset managers. If you've kept Larry Fink happy, if you've kept State Street and Vanguard happy, regardless of what you've done to the actual company, they're your boss. They're who replaces or picks your boards of directors. We saw that with Exxon when they weren't happy with him. They can shield you from the consequences of the free market that we're supposed to be operating in. And so I think when you see a company go out of its way to poke its customers' values poke them in the face, attack their values. We've seen it with Target, and yet you don't see consequences, right? Something is amiss. And I think what you see is that it's these large pools of capital that don't see it as their job to apply market discipline, but instead protect people who are a part of their political coalition.
Okay, first of all, I got to say I like that you said hoovered up instead of vacuumed up the money. I appreciate that. Now, regarding that, you bring up Target as well. I mean, the laws of free market economics, and we can argue about how free market we are or not, but ultimately, bad things begin to happen to these companies in the markets and among consumers, which we're beginning to see when they're listening to a BlackRock as opposed to listening to the consumers.
Yeah, it's true, and we've seen that with Disney more than anybody. I mean, if you look at that stock, it's performed horribly. At the same time that the rest of the market is up double digits, I think if you invested in Disney 5 years ago, I think you're down something like 20%. Imagine having, peel back 5-10 years before they went super woke. Imagine having access to all of the goodwill that company has, like literally decades of people's childhood memories being associated with those movies and those characters and those parks. How do you blow that? How do you make that worse? And yet, while we have seen a shift a little bit with Iger being put back in as CEO, really it was just because he's better at handling some of the I think the theory is that he's just better at handling some of the backlash for the wokeness than he's going to change anything, because he was the one who put it in there in the first place. So I think that speaks to one of the problems with ESG. It's not just, a lot of people like to focus on, well, it hurts shareholders, and that's very important. Don't get me wrong. People invest in companies because they need that money to retire on, and that's very important. But consumers, we're a consumer protection organization. Consumers are really the ones who get attacked by this across the board. You can not own a share of Disney, and you're still affected by the fact that they're running around destroying all of these beloved characters and your family experiences. And if you're in Florida, ruining portions of the Orlando economy by scaring everybody off with this woke nonsense. So the funny thing is that if you look at all of the, Larry Fink loves to talk about stakeholder capitalism. You got to look at all the people that rely on or deal with the company, the vendors, the laborers, the customers, right? If you look at who benefits from the ESG complex, right? Consumers are hurt, shareholders are hurt, vendors are hurt, workers are laid off, right? No one benefits except for what? Wall Street fat cats, like Larry Fink at BlackRock, and far left megalomaniacs, like Larry Fink at BlackRock, right? There's really only two groups that benefit, and I think everyone else is made to pay.
So, you guys have been very successful raising awareness, and I know working with state treasurers and attorneys general in the states, divesting from BlackRock, but they're still a massive, massive company. What do you recommend conservatives begin to think about policy-wise? Absolutely.
Well, the good news is this entire thing was built on a house of cards. There's a number of things wrong with it. One, it violates fiduciary duty, the legal duty that these companies have to their investors, right? So once you alert state elected officials like AGs, governors, treasurers, money can be taken back from the misbehaving companies like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, moved to companies, I think we're gonna have Vivek here later today, right? That promise to adhere by the fiduciary duty. So that's step one. Step two, there's a number of different investigations going on because this also seems to be a clear violation of antitrust law. As I mentioned before, BlackRock isn't even doing this by themselves. They are joining groups where they promise to coordinate with other actors in the market. Now, it's been a while since I was in law school, but that's kind of antitrust 101. If a bunch of owners of businesses get together and talk about what they're going to do collectively to set supply in a market, that's an antitrust violation. And the last thing is, I do think there's a really good, important question here about securities fraud. I mentioned before that there's a lot of people probably in this room who are invested in an ESG fund that doesn't have that on the label, right? You've been snookered into being part of Larry Fink's ESG complex without being told about it. So there's really three legal avenues right off the bat that can be pursued. And I think both from, this is something I think it's good that Vivek's going to be here later today, given that he's running for president, both at the state level, but then obviously at the federal level with the FTC, the SEC, and the DOJ. If there was a Republican in the White House who cared about this could go away very quickly because of the enforcement mechanisms that are already U.S. law.
Yeah, that's a good point. The Biden administration has shown no interest whatsoever in pursuing these matters, and yet people are seeing rates of return that could be higher go down because of the policies that are being pursued. I know Louisiana, I think Florida, a number of state treasurers have pulled out, but you have BlackRock still at 4 or 5 billion, maybe higher than that, dollars that they control.
Yeah. They, depending on the day in the markets, because they're mostly passive, it's somewhere between $9 and $10 trillion of assets under managed.
Wow.
They have more money than most countries have. Again, that said, look, a large portion of that is the Federal Thrift Savings Plan. This is the pension fund for the U.S. military, right? And it's being used to undermine our national security and our national economy. And one thing we haven't mentioned yet is kind of the Chinese connection to this. The net effect of ESG policies, because BlackRock and the other asset managers don't push the same standards overseas that they push here. So when they go to China, they're more than happy to finance coal-powered plants, natural gas pipelines, natural gas plants. Here in the United States, they are openly, aggressively pushing publicly traded utilities to set early retirement dates for these same assets, these same coal-fired plants and these same natural gas plants, which, by the way, produce 65% of the electricity that powers our grid and keeps these lights on today, right? So the net effect of that, right, is to build up China's economy at the same time that you're hampering the U.S. economy. And that's another area where I think that, we're starting to see the House Judiciary, House Financial Services Committee House Select Committee on China really look into that and say, wait, why is the pension fund for the U.S. military helping to build up the economy of a country that we could be in a hot conflict or at least a cold conflict within the next 10 years? Okay,
so I'm glad you bring this topic up with China and ESG because, I remember when the Soviet Union fell, and we were under Boris Yeltsin's regime able to go in and look at the Soviet archives, we found there were a lot of nonprofit groups in the West, peace activists, environmental groups that the Soviets had actually surreptitiously been funding. And those groups were anti-nuclear campaigns, environmental campaigns. That's why so many environmentalists in the 80s were called watermelons. They were green on the outside and red on the inside. Commies hiding. And we know now that China has been funding, for example, the New York Times did this massive story a week ago. I was shocked the New York Times ran it on left-wing philanthropists pushing in the peace movement through Code Pink and others, Chinese talking points, Chinese positions. They're funding environmentalist groups in this country. I mean, obviously, wild speculation, never ask a question you don't know the answer to, but there just does seem to be some willingness for these massive companies, and I assume it's just they think China's on the verge of dominance, they should suck up now, but pushing agendas that do benefit the Chinese at our expense.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And BlackRock has famously had a cozy relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. This is some tinfoil hat theory. It was reported in the Wall Street Journal that during the Trump administration's negotiations with the CCP on tariffs, Larry Fink was aiding CCP officials in those negotiations. He was helping advise them on how to deal with the Trump administration. So, I mean, this guy is about as entangled as you can get, and he's got a lot of benefits for that. They've been given the right to run the first wholly foreign-owned mutual fund in mainland China. Ironically, they were given the right which is incredibly rare. I don't think anyone else has it. The ability as a wholly foreign-owned corporation to manage pension funds in mainland China. And so whether there's direct funding coming from China to push ESG, it doesn't matter because the quid pro quo, the favors that BlackRock is getting and other asset managers are getting to do business in mainland China, right, is an incentive for them to push these ESG criteria here in the United States, this ESG agenda that harms, Chinese competitors here in the United States. And we've seen this, again, this isn't, I don't have every jot and tittle of this, but there was a lot of theorizing that a lot of the funding for some of the environmental groups in the net zero groups in particular in Europe that were pushing was coming from Russia because
that's right.
Here's the strange thing. If you wanted net zero, right, what would be the quickest way to get there, right, from an electrical generation standpoint? It would be nuclear technology, right? That's the, powerful, reliable, clean, no emissions of any kind, right? Except for steam. And yet Germany, at the same time that they're supposedly, going as hard as they can to net zero, is shutting down their nuclear plants, and their green movement is leading the way, right, in pushing for those to be shut down, which is incredibly suspicious to me that if your stated goal is to hit net zero, and the same thing, ESG has been singularly focused on these so-called renewable technologies, wind farms, solar panels. These things, first of all, are not net zero. They have to be produced under very carbon-intensive manufacturing processes using extremely harmful heavy metals, mined in the Congo, often by unpaid child workers, let's say, and then processed almost exclusively and built almost exclusively in China. So if we're really trying to get to net zero, why would we be so focused on that? Wouldn't Larry Fink be dumping as much money as he could into nuclear technology? And yet you don't see any of that. So I think you're right to suspect. And again, I don't have any documents, whistleblower documents to wave in front of you. So I want to be careful. But it does raise some, I think, serious questions about who's really behind this ESG agenda.
I heard the ringer. One of the things that I find so, I guess, alarming to me is the dismissiveness of a lot of the press that covers these, even the business press. And the business press, I think, in this country is not, increasingly isn't as objective as maybe it once was. When you're covering a lot of companies, you want access to the CEOs, you want them to come to your conferences, you're not giving them critical treatment. And BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, the others do seem to skate by because of the access they give to sponsor the financial conferences of the major news networks, to come to the events, to hang out with them. I know there are media outlets in this country that exist because of access, and you're not going to write critically of someone who's giving you that sort of access. And so now we've got a situation where you can't get a fair hearing in the American press for something like ESG. It sounds like a kooky conspiracy theory from the right, and yet it's real.
Yeah, it's crazy. And depending on the audience, I kind of decide which details about the ESG I'm going to go into, because if I really went, you'd think I was up here with a tinfoil hat on. It's run out of the UN, by the way. Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is one of these big groups that the big banks are part of, the big asset managers are part of, the big insurers are part of, where they've all committed to coordinate their activities, right, across the entire financial market to push these ESG standards. It's a UN-run organization, and guess who's the head of it? Michael Bloomberg, right? Guess who's the lieutenant?
I was going to say Yemen, but Michael Bloomberg works.
Guess who's the lieutenant in charge of the COO? An employee of Michael Bloomberg, right? So you have the UN running this Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, run by Michael Bloomberg and an employee of Michael Bloomberg, and the big banks even agreed to have the UN start auditing their loan portfolio to make sure that their loan portfolios are in accordance with their commitments to push for net zero. So I know it sounds crazy that the United Nations is literally forcing all this on the United States, but that's where they've organized. It's literally, you can go on the website and you can see the CEO's signature where they've signed this stuff.
And yet, I know there's continues to be concern among conservatives and people in general, the idea of the Great Reset and the things that come out of Davos and the World Economic Forum, and these are the ways they try to advance it. And yet, democracy still matters, and voter backlash matters greatly when it comes to seeing pension plans degraded because you're not getting the return on investment they otherwise want. Voters tend to get mad and throw people out.
100% right. I like having a little bit longer to talk about this than normally a 5-minute, because if you just explain the problem, people go, okay, I'm up against the asset managers and the biggest banks and the insurers. I guess I'll just go live in a cave
and the United
somewhere.
Nations.
And the United Nations, right? And Michael Bloomberg. He'll unleash his meme army. But I like to leave people with a lot of hope, because I'm very hopeful. In the last 18 months, this went from some bizarre issue where I once had you talked about the reporters being biased. I once had a reporter ask me, this was I won't say who it was, but this is somebody who worked for one of the top financial press associations. I was explaining ESG, what the problem was with it, and I was explaining the UN connection. And the person goes, why would the average American care about a bunch of bureaucrats in the United Nations setting really technical details and targets for the American economy? I'm like, why would the average American care about having the details of their lives set by some unelected bureaucrats in the United Nations, right? I think we're well past that. I think they understand that this is a massive issue. BlackRock is backing off of it. They're trying to rebrand and do that. We've seen Anheuser-Busch, despite what we've talked about, but the CEO still having a job. Everyone's writing stories about Target sales are down. Disney's just dropping bomb after bomb at the box office. American consumers should feel more empowered today than probably at any other time in U.S. history, except for maybe during the big, the trust-busting era of the 1920s and 30s and the Roosevelt era. This isn't me claiming credit. No one's leading this boycott. No one called from a red phone and said, boycott Anheuser-Busch. What you're seeing is the collective frustration of American consumers who've been attacked and insulted and degraded. Say, enough is enough. I don't have to buy your product. I don't have to go to Target. I don't have to watch your stupid movie that attacks me. I'm done. And whether it takes a month or a year, or a decade, if you keep the pressure up, to your point, it doesn't matter at some level. The stranglehold that BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard have, it will break. Because at some level, someone will just come in and if the stock goes to near zero, someone will just go buy up the company and take it private. We saw that with Elon Musk. Twitter had been mismanaged. He goes, I can do this better than that. I'll just buy the thing. Probably regrets buying it 6 months prior than he did, later than he did. But we should feel empowered. I have a lot of hope that this thing is going to fall apart. Like I said, it's built on a house of cards, both legally, but also just public perception-wise. As soon as people realize it, the average American, right, middle, left, they go, that's not right. I get letters from people on the left saying, I'm a left-wing progressive, but I don't really want Larry Fink deciding how Americans' lives are going to run. So I do think there is some chance for not only a backlash, but even a bipartisan one.
So let's spend a little bit of time on consumers research. It's been around for a while, but I mean, you guys really did get on my radar of a lot of the stuff you're doing with the ESG fight. What all does consumers research do?
That's a great question. We're the nation's oldest consumer protection organization. We were founded in 1929, and I know I am aging wonderfully. But in truth, I came on about 3.5 years ago with the idea of taking the organization. We saw all this woke capitalism happening, all these, and this was before even the Tranheiser-Bush issue. You had, and this will matter for Georgia, you had that almost peak wokeness in 2020, spring of 2021, where states like Georgia were passing just common sense issues around election integrity and changing what days they could just the kind of stuff that governments are supposed to be doing. Did it here, did it in Texas. And you had all these corporations signing these crazy letters talking about you're making it sound like Jim Crow 2.0, like we were going to go back to 1930s Germany or something like that if you were required to show an ID when you voted. And often getting all the details wrong, but that's a whole other issue. And so the idea was we need to push back against this woke capitalism. So in June of 2021, we launched the Consumers First initiative, which is our ongoing multi-million-dollar ad campaign to call out woke corporations who are focusing on far-left activists rather than serving their consumers. And I would say that woke capitalism is kind of like the symptom, and ESG is the disease. So we had to kind of point to the symptom and say, hey, have you noticed all these corporations seem to hate your guts lately? That's kind of bad. Ran ads against Nike, Coca-Cola, American Airlines, Ticketmaster, MLB for moving the All-Star game out of Atlanta to a state with more restrictive voting requirements than Georgia was going to pass. But then we always knew we wanted to help people understand the phenomenon and then get to the cause of it. And that's when we launched our ongoing ads just against BlackRock. Now, in terms of the other stuff we do, we have a long history of doing two things. One, educating consumers about issues that are important to them, and two, amplifying their voice in the marketplace. And that's really what we've been doing for the last 90 years, and that's what we're doing today.
Okay, so let's get into these other corporations. You and I have had this discussion before, and that I didn't realize at the time that in the DEI space, so tied into ESG, that you have a situation where it's such a protective, incestuous setup that the CEOs of many major companies are almost browbeaten into doing things they know they shouldn't do, because otherwise the chief diversity officer that's embedded in the company is going to say, you're a racist. CEO gets fired. The chief diversity officer gets booted to the Ivy League.
You're 100% right. And that's one of the questions I do get from the incredulous press is they'll go well, if this is really so bad, why don't you have every corporation, every CEO in America, standing up and saying, I'm not going to take this anymore? It's well, because they'll fire them. That's the whole point of the ESG complex, is that the asset managers will replace their boards of directors, the banks will punish them in the corporate bond market, and the insurers will say, well, we can't insure your company anymore because you're not hitting net zero targets or you don't have a big enough DEI program. And to your point, the DEI departments are in a symbiotic relationship with the asset managers because there's sort of this fifth column within the company. I like to say they're cancerous both in the pejorative sense, but also in the technical sense, right? In the sense that the cancer cell doesn't serve a purpose in the body, right? Its only job is to make itself bigger and suck up more of the resources of its host. And that's really what DEI departments do. They don't serve the investors in the slightest bit. They don't add to the bottom line of the company, and they don't help them serve their consumers in the slightest bit. So again, and they don't help the company in any way. What they do is they have a symbiotic relationship with these asset managers to push the company further and further left right? And kind of just propagate this far left ideology, and they'll protect each other. To your point, if you go against your DEI department, these CEOs normally, if you get mad at your chief operating officer or your chief technology officer or your CFO or whatever, you fire him. That's that's your job as the CEO. The problem is if you fire your head of DEI, that's going to play a lot differently in the press. And then you might have BlackRock lowering your ESG score and going, we noticed you had some issues around race issues or sex issues or whatever it is, and they're going to come down on you. So there's a lot of CEOs, we get through things through back channels. There are a lot of the C-suite in America that's on our side. And I wish they would grow some backbone, because unfortunately, whether your job's at stake or not, you still have to do the right thing. And so I wish they would stand up and push back. But it's not as far gone as it would look like. It's just that a lot of these people in these C-suites, despite their bank accounts, worry a lot about losing their jobs or more importantly, their reputation. Being called a racist isn't fun. Being called a sexist isn't fun. So that is part of the complex as well. And I think we won't really be done with this whole thing until, serving in a DEI department for a while will be, a little bit like, having done a stint in the SS or something. You'd be like, we'll just cover that part of my resume up, because that's really what they're pushing is a bunch of racist, sexist policies in corporate America. It's disgusting.
Yeah, it's just the number of people I hear from when I talk about this issue on the radio, and the DEI tasks and staff within their companies. It's like their entire job is to stir up division within the company and to force people to go to these workshops. I remember going just back to my law school days where your introduction to law school, you had to go sit into one of those DEI sessions, and it was a big joke to everyone except the very serious angry woman at the front of the room who insisted that this room was filled with homophobes and racists, and everybody's having to put labels on each other's back, and based on the stereotypical reaction to them, you had to guess what is the label on my back, and it's like you're exploiting. It just was mind-numbing to experience this, and yet we've got the Robin DiAngelos of the world and the Ibram Kendis of the world, and they profit off of keeping this stuff spread and alive.
You're 100% right, and the scientific studies of these so-called anti-bias trainings is that, surprise, surprise, by locking people in a room and drilling them about racial and sexual stereotypes for hours at a time, you actually enhance their views of people based on stereotypes. I know that's crazy to think. It does the opposite. Now, that said, I don't know if that's by accident or not, because if you look at the whole DEI complex and what, for example, Larry, that now infamous quote where he talks about, at BlackRock, we believe that behaviors will only change if they're forced to change, and at BlackRock, we're forcing behaviors to change. What he was actually referring to was racial and sex-based quotas for the boards of directors for the companies that he has, control of a portion of their shares. And if you think about it, that's the genius of the patronage system that the left wants to build, which is, I think there are fantastic women, people of all racial ethnicities who are competent, who can run companies, who can be parts of boards of directors, right? They don't need a giveaway from Larry Fink to have their job. So Larry Fink can't control them because they don't need anything from him. The people that need Larry Fink, the people that need the Robin DiAngelos and the Ibram Kendis and will swear an allegiance to the left are the people who are only there because they are bean counting race and sex and these quotas, right? So it's not to say that it's a kind of genius thing where you, instead of finding the most competent people across all these categories, you find people who are not the most meritorious, and you put them there because they know that they need you to be there. And it's a smart play politically from kind of a Machiavellian standpoint, but it's actually going to ruin our economy and our markets and our experience of consumers.
So looking out a couple of years, how do you see the landscape evolving on this issue as they change names and focus group and try to stay in people's good graces?
Well, I think that's one of the things that's also impressed me about the average person over the last 10 years is I think they've gotten, again, hip to that trick that the left just keeps trying to remember when they told us that CRT didn't exist at the same time that a lot of these school districts had directors of CRT? They're not, they're kind of running short on plays, right? And now it just becomes these constant rebranding exercises. They tell you CRT doesn't exist, and then they tell you it's not that big of a deal, and then they tell you, well, it's happening, but it's not that not that much, and then they tell you, well, it is happening, but it's good actually. They kind of did the same thing with ESG. They did it with the DEI. Like I said, they're going to change the sustainability or something like that. But I think that's the key concept is to see it as the phenomenon, not the acronym. The acronym's irrelevant. They could have called it anything. But the phenomenon of going into schools and teaching kids that you bear some sort of sin because of the color of your skin, or that capitalism is inherently white supremacist, or so is this country. The phenomenon of having a department within the company whose job it is to view people only as their race or their sex or their sexual orientation and not the full human being. The phenomenon of financial institutions using their market power, colluding with each other to push a far left progressive agenda. If we stay focused on these things, and we have been, they could hire every corporate flack PR guy they want. It's not going to matter because we're going to keep the foot on the pedal and pushing back. I'm hopeful, and the last 18 months, not 24 months, would suggest that's exactly what the American people are doing.
Let's say 2024 goes our direction and we're able to get the White House, we're able to secure the Senate and hold the House. What policy initiatives do you think that the Republicans need to advance if that happens?
Yeah, I think in terms of ESG, investigation and enforcement. We don't, it's great. I could certainly sit here and tell you there's legislative ideas I've got for how to push back on ESG. But I think conservatives have this idea that the free market means that when you're in power, you just don't do anything at all. You just put your feet up on the desk no, if you believe in the free market, as I do, and you're a lover of free market, then our job is to police it within the bounds of well-established, fiduciary duty precedes America. It's British common law from 500 years ago, right? Enforcing the fiduciary duty, the duty of loyalty and the duty of care against asset managers is not a violation of the free market. It is protecting the free market. It would be like if you're playing football, and I love football, I'm sure we're in Georgia, you love football.
Oh yes.
It would be like if you were a referee, finally we've got a Republican referee that's going to be in charge of football, and you just didn't enforce any of the rules of football. Because it's I wouldn't want to, I'm a free football guy, I don't want to get involved.
Yeah.
Right, it's well then you're not playing football anymore, right? I'm not saying we need to go in there and do a whole tiny little regulations and second guess every decision that's made and set prices. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about common law principles that were established, antitrust legislation that's over 100 years old, security fraud legislation that's over 100 years old, enforcing that, making them adhere to the rules of the game. That's not a violation of the free market, that's protecting it, right? And so that's what I would like to see. I think the Federal Trade Commission has a role in that. I think the SEC absolutely, first of all, you got to roll back all the nonsense that's come out of this SEC. But I think the Securities Exchange Commission, not the Southeastern Conference. And then I'm sure this is going to light some hair on fire at the BlackRock headquarters, but I think the DOJ has a role in this. I think there's been some antitrust has a criminal portion to it, and I think when you're looking at the damage that has been done to this economy, imagine you're a large family in the Midwest and you're trying to get by. We've got the Ukraine conflict adding to inflation issues and COVID adding to supply chain issues, and then you have this Wall Street fat cat, Larry Fink and his ilk, who've been contributing to inflation, contributing to energy inflation, making electricity more expensive. I think that's a big deal. I think that's a real big deal. It sounds like, well, money, we shouldn't get that angry about money. But this is people's ability to eat, to keep the lights on, to keep their businesses running. I think it's a real issue, and I think the next administration would do well to take it very, very seriously.
That's such a good point, because I forget to even think about it in this aspect oftentimes, that we don't need to pass new laws. We've got so many laws already on the books that just need to be deployed, and this administration is very odd in how they decide to enforce and unenforce things. And I'm sure Hunter Biden will have a great new way to cash in and maybe get on a BlackRock board somewhere to be their chief diversity officer, where it's diversity of substance as opposed to diversity of people.
Yeah.
But in that regard, Calvin Coolidge said that the business of government is business, obviously, but also that government's job is to ensure a level playing field. And so much of what the Democrats have done, and it's been a bipartisan problem, but really Democrats have unleveled the playing field so that these big companies can do things. And Republicans, you're right, have been very laissez-faire in how they enforce regulations, and we need to have maybe prosecutors with more teeth.
Absolutely. And one of the core concepts of America is equal protection under law, meaning the rule of law. Meaning just because Hunter Biden's on your board doesn't mean you can get away with whatever you want, right? Especially when they're going and enforcing those same laws on other companies. If there was a right-wing BlackRock, it wouldn't last 5 minutes. If they were running around with other asset managers to get, Starbucks, hey, we want to see more Christmas on those cups. There would be people would getting perp walked out of charity dinners and that kind of stuff within a day. Right? And so again, it's not a violation of the free market to say, hey, these are the rules. It's gonna be applied to everybody, not just people, like you said, with Hunter Biden on their board or with BlackRock. Here's the irony. They just added the CEO of Saudi Aramco, right? The largest oil producer in the world, to their board. Now that's a foreign oil producer, so that's okay.
Right.
If Darren Woods from Exxon got on there, that would be
right.
That would be true hypocrisy, right? So again, yeah, absolutely. We need a level playing field so that people can know what the rules are, not just who do I need to pay off so that these rules don't apply to me.
Okay, so I guess the clock says we got less than 8 minutes here. Real world practical terms. Individual Americans are concerned with this. Their 401k is out of their hands. Their company's chosen Vanguard or State Street. I know my company has chosen Vanguard. They've got a pension. They don't even know where it is. They're in the military. What can they do? Is there anything that they can do to...
Absolutely. The number one thing they can do is call their elected representatives because this ESG thing, they've hidden it with all this wonky acronyms and complex, the mumbo jumbo. The average elected official, you educate them about it and they go, man, I got to do something about that. But educating an elected official is part of it. Helping them understand that their electorate cares about it, that's where the magic happens. And so just calling up your governor, your senators, your state representatives, your treasurers, your AGs, and tell them, I know this is a weird, wonky issue, and I'm not saying I know everything about it or what even should be done, but I want to see something happen. I want pushback. That makes a difference. Don't feel like you need to understand every, inner working of Wall Street in order to push back on this. Just expressing your will that something be fixed is a huge step in the right direction. The other thing is to keep the pressure on. I don't think people follow what Will Hild thinks you should do about Anheuser-Busch or Target. In fact, I don't want it that way. I think it's great that people are organically across the country just saying, no, I'm not buying this. I also think it's great. I think part of the kind of recipes for success that we've had is that in the old days when people would call for boycotts in the 80s and the 90s, let's say you're a member of the Southern Baptist Convention. I remember when they boycotted Disney. It was sort of like, okay, I've gotten the message that I'm supposed to boycott Disney. Like, I'm not going to Disney. Well, kind of boring. Like, you're just not doing anything, right? It's like the absence of activity, right? Well, now, like, you go on social media and like TikTok and Twitter and X and Instagram, and people are making all these like funny videos, making fun of Anheuser-Busch, making fun of Target, like. Getting in, that is, if you want to light a company's hair on fire, like you want to ruin marketing's day, that's the kind of stuff. I swear, these people wake up at 5 a.m. and they're scrolling obsessively. What do I have to deal with today? When we launched our ads, we've heard through back channels that against American Airlines, it dominated the entire C-suite's activities for an entire week. That's all they did was focus on our advertising campaign. So when you launch these things, when you make funny videos, your voice matters. And then the last thing I'd say is that when you stop using their product or considering stop using their product, I think again, because we have this like free market meme and they're like, I'm not using the product and their sales are going to go down. Well, like I can tell you from working inside a congressional office, if a candidate's numbers are going down, you don't always know why. Right? You just see, people less support them, but like you have to really do a bunch of research. It's the same thing for companies. You could see a sales dip, and if you haven't called their customer service line, if you haven't sent them an email and tell them why you're angry and what it would take to win your business back, if there is a way they could win your business back, then it's going to take a long time for them to really. They're going to be hiring like tons of researchers and PR guys. It's a lot easier if at the same time you're making that decision to go and just tell the company, here's why. That will make a much bigger difference than stopping to use their product. And then I know I said last thing, but I just thought of one last thing.
No, that's right.
A lot of these companies have retail faces, Target in particular. We ran another campaign we didn't talk about was State Farm. It turns out that they were pushing transgender ideology on kids as young as 5 through something called the Gender Cool Project that a lot of companies admittedly were supporting at the time. And it was reported in the media that after we blew the whistle on them, I think there's like 19,000 State Farm independent salesmen across the country. A full quarter of them called corporate on that day because hundreds of their customers were calling them and saying, "What? Are you out of your mind?" Right? Going in and talking to the frontline person, I know it's not fun. They're not the person that made the decision, but going into a Target and saying, "Hey, I'm here to buy Coca-Cola." Well, hopefully not a Coca-Cola, but I'm here to, I'm here to buy a shirt from not that section. I'd like to talk to your manager for 5 minutes and just say, "Hey, I used to do all my shopping here. Now I only come here when I have to because of what you guys are doing. Could you please let corporate know?" That really does make a difference. I know it doesn't sound like it because I'm not talking to the CEO, I'm not talking to the marketing guy, I'm not talking to the big decision. That feeds up. It really does.
Will, listen, this has been educational and delightful. We've got 3 minutes here, and I just want you to tell them, because you've mentioned it twice, and I am negligent for not having brought it up. Explain to them the American Airlines ad campaign, because I love that one.
Yeah, so you had CEO Doug Parker, who's CEO at the time. He was the CEO of American Airlines, and American Airlines had been rated the worst airline in America 2 years in a row by the Wall Street Journal.
They still are.
They lose them. They lose the most bags. They kick the most people off of flights involuntarily. And during COVID, they actually shortened legroom. So while everyone, the flying's done, you'd think you'd be doing whatever you can to just beg people to come back. They're making it less enjoyable to fly their airplanes. Well, they needed, like most airlines, they needed a massive bailout from the U.S. taxpayer, courtesy of you and me, to stay in operation that year in 2020. That same year, right, at the end of that year, they gave Doug Parker, he took a 8-figure bonus in stock options. Thanks for you and me, because if we hadn't bailed him out, he wouldn't have been in operations. 5 months later, during that spring of 2021 that I mentioned, he's going into Texas and basically saying that Texas is turning into Jim Crow 2.0 because they're going to require IDs at the ballot box. I mean, here's this guy, he's getting an 8. Just shut up, man. You're getting paid, right, by the U.S. taxpayer. Don't poke everyone in the eye. And so we decided it's egregious. And it's just a side note, because I'm as you might tell, I'm a kind of inside baseball guy on Wall Street. When he had taken over the company, in 2016, they had $5 billion in the bank, right? They had plenty of money. And he spent down all of it and more, actually borrowed money, to do stock buybacks, because all of his compensation was stock-based. So he rated the treasury of that company. Instead of improving the planes, instead of improving the experience, he rated the treasury of that company. So when they came hat in hand to us, the U.S. taxpayers, in 2020, we've only got $500 million. We're about to run up. Well, do the math. They had $500 million at that point. They had $5 billion in 2016. If he'd have just run the place right, they wouldn't have needed a taxpayer-funded bailout. So I just think that's the whole scheme. Is, again, they're cozying up to woke activists and woke politicians instead of serving their customers, and that's what we called them out for. And I don't want to claim victory, but I will say we ran our ads, and 4 months later the board kicked him out.
Yeah,
of the CEO position.
I directly attribute yourself to it. So thank you very much for spending time with me. Thanks. This has been great.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks
Absolutely.
so much. Sir. Thank y'all. Really appreciate it.